From the ashes of the most destructive war in human history rose a new kind of conflict, one without constant gunfire, without official battle declarations, yet more dangerous than any war before it. When World War II ended in 1945, the world hoped for peace, stability, and cooperation. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and nations were exhausted. But instead of unity, the world slowly drifted into fear, suspicion, and division. This silent global struggle became known as the Cold War, a conflict that shaped politics, economies, science, warfare, and human lives for nearly half a century. It was not a war of direct fighting between two armies, but a war of ideologies, power, influence, and survival. The Cold War primarily emerged between two superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. These nations had fought together as allies during World War II against Nazi Germany, yet the alliance was temporary and built on necessity, not trust. Once the common enemy was defeated, the hidden cracks in their relationship quickly turned into deep fractures. The Cold War was not born overnight. It developed slowly, fueled by historical distrust, ideological opposition, political ambition, and fear of domination. One of the most important and fundamental causes of the Cold War was ideological conflict. The United States believed in capitalism, democracy, free markets, and individual freedoms. In contrast, the Soviet Union followed communism, a system based on state control of resources, a single ruling party, and the belief that economic equality was more important than political freedom. Both systems claimed to represent the future of humanity. To American leaders, communism appeared oppressive, authoritarian, and dangerous to freedom. To Soviet leaders, capitalism seemed exploitative, imperialistic, and designed to benefit only the wealthy. These opposing beliefs were not just political ideas, they were worldviews that shaped how each side understood morality, justice, and progress. Because neither side believed the other system could peacefully coexist, competition was inevitable. Historical mistrust between the Soviet Union and Western powers further intensified these ideological differences. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, Western countries, including the United States and Britain, openly opposed the new communist government and even intervened militarily during the Russian Civil War. This left a deep scar in Soviet memory, creating the belief that capitalist nations would always try to destroy communism. Later, during the 1930s, the Soviet Union watched Western powers adopt appeasement policies toward Adolf Hitler, allowing Nazi Germany to grow stronger. Soviet leaders suspected that Britain and France hoped Germany would attack the Soviet Union instead of the West. These experiences convinced the Soviet leadership that the West could not be trusted. World War II itself played a major role in shaping Cold War tensions. The Soviet Union suffered unimaginable losses during the war, with over 20 million citizens killed and entire regions destroyed. While the Western Allies eventually opened a second front in Europe, it came later than Stalin had hoped. This delay increased Soviet suspicion that the West was willing to let the Soviet Union bleed. At the same time, as the Red Army pushed German forces back toward Berlin, it occupied large parts of Eastern Europe. What the Soviets saw as liberation and security, the West saw as occupation and expansion. When the war ended, Europe was left devastated and politically unstable. Traditional powers like Britain and France were weakened, creating a power vacuum. Into this vacuum stepped the United States and the Soviet Union as the world's two dominant superpowers. With no strong third force to balance them, the international system became bipolar. Each superpower believed that allowing the other to expand influence would threaten global stability and its own security. This struggle for influence became a defining feature of the Cold War. The situation in Eastern Europe became one of the earliest and most visible sources of conflict. The Soviet Union established communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. Although these governments were officially independent, they were closely controlled by Moscow. Western nations argued that this violated the promise of free elections and self-determination. The Soviet Union defended its actions by pointing to history, emphasizing that it had been invaded from the West multiple times and needed friendly governments as a buffer zone. This disagreement over Eastern Europe hardened divisions and made compromise increasingly difficult. Economic rivalry also fueled Cold War tensions. In 1947, the United States introduced the Marshall Plan, offering financial aid to rebuild war-torn European economies. While the plan helped Western Europe recover rapidly, the Soviet Union rejected it, viewing it as a tool of American economic imperialism. Moscow also forced Eastern European countries to refuse the aid. As a result, Europe became economically divided, with capitalist economies in the West and centrally planned economies in the East. This economic separation reinforced political and ideological divisions. Another critical turning point was the development of nuclear weapons. The United States' use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 demonstrated unprecedented destructive power. Initially, the United States held a nuclear monopoly, which created fear and insecurity in the Soviet Union. When the Soviets successfully tested their own atomic bomb in 1949, a dangerous nuclear arms race began. Both sides built increasingly powerful weapons, including hydrogen bombs, capable of destroying entire civilizations. The concept of mutually assured destruction meant that any direct war could lead to global annihilation. Fear became a permanent part of international relations. The Cold War intensified through a series of crises and confrontations. The division of Germany and Berlin symbolized the larger division of the world. The Berlin blockade and airlift of 1948 to 49 showed how quickly tensions could escalate. The creation of military alliances such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact locked nations into opposing camps, making conflicts global rather than local. Even small regional disputes risked triggering a superpower confrontation. As the Cold War progressed, it spread far beyond Europe. Newly independent nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America became battlegrounds for influence. The Korean War, Vietnam War, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and numerous conflicts in Africa and Latin America turned the Cold War into a truly global struggle. These were not direct wars between the superpowers, but proxy wars, where local populations paid the highest price. Millions of civilians were killed, economies were destroyed, and entire generations grew up in conflict zones. So the question arises, who suffered the most damage during the Cold War? While the United States and the Soviet Union invested massive resources into weapons and technology, it was often smaller and weaker nations that suffered the greatest losses. Countries like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and many African and Latin American states experienced prolonged violence, political instability, and economic destruction. Ordinary people paid the price for decisions made by distant superpowers. Despite its dangers, the Cold War also produced important lessons. After moments of extreme tension, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, both sides realized how close they had come to nuclear disaster. This led to limited cooperation, arms control agreements, and diplomatic communication. The Cold War entered periods of reduced tension known as détente, although rivalry never fully disappeared. The final phase of the Cold War began in the 1980s. The Soviet Union faced severe economic problems, technological stagnation, and internal dissatisfaction. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he introduced reforms known as glasnost and perestroika, aiming to modernize the Soviet system. He reduced military spending, improved relations with the West, and allowed greater political openness. These changes weakened the rigid control of the communist system. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the collapse of communist control in Eastern Europe. One by one, communist governments fell without major military intervention. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, marking the end of the Cold War. The conflict that had defined global politics for nearly 50 years ended not with a final battle, but with economic failure, political reform, and the realization that confrontation was unsustainable. In conclusion, the Cold War was the result of deep ideological differences, historical mistrust, power competition, security fears, and human ambition. It reshaped the world without a traditional battlefield, yet its consequences were felt everywhere. It taught humanity the dangers of unchecked rivalry and the importance of dialogue in a nuclear age. While the Cold War ended, its lessons remain vital today, reminding us that peace is fragile, power must be balanced with responsibility, and the future of humanity depends not on domination, but cooperation.